Well, good morning, everyone. Morning, good morning. We're going to be streaming this morning also, like we have been, just to let everybody here in the audience know. The lessons are recorded. If you'd like to hear them, you can hear them on our YouTube page. For those who might not know, got it recording. All right, let's get started this morning. We're going to look at the second part of our Genesis lesson, which is the bigger theme here. Is we're looking at how the Torah, how this first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures fit together with New Testament Christianity. And so this first section of the Old Testament is what we call it in Christianity. Maybe a more accurate term might be Hebrew Scriptures. That's what you'll probably hear me call it. This first section starting here is made up of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And these 5 books are the foundation block of all of the Hebrew Scriptures and really of the whole Bible. Jesus calls them in Luke chapter 24 and verse 44. He says, "These are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, all of these things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms." And so we talked about how the Hebrews generally split up the Scriptures into 3 books or 3 collections of books. And the first one was called the Torah, the law. And Torah just means law. It's nothing fancy there. In historical terms, these first 5 books, they take us from the creation of the universe to the moment when the people of Israel reached the borders of the land that God had promised them. And He had promised them that land here in our lesson today. We're in about chapter 12 of Genesis. I'm not going to be in any specific chapter because I'm going to take things sort of topically. We're going to look at Abraham and Isaac today, and then next Sunday we'll look at Jacob and Jacob's sons, or mainly Joseph, because he's sort of one of the main characters there at the end of Genesis. But the story, let me back up. Genesis, the word, means beginnings, and that title Genesis comes from the Greek translation of the word beginnings. It is the Genesis story. It is the beginnings. And so we're especially looking for the purpose and the meaning of the story. We're trying to look at the big picture of what's going on. And the story begins with God creating mankind in the world and declaring that they're good. 6 times he declares that they're good, and the seventh time he declares that they are very good, this creation. Soon, though, this creation is going to rebel. The goodness of God is going to be rejected by humanity when they prove over and over that they would rather choose to define for themselves right and wrong, and they try and seize control over their life and their destiny. And that begins in the garden by taking hold of the fruit that they were told not to take hold of, right? And that tree represents a crossroads. It represents a choice that has to be made. And so this is going to lead to that downward spiral of self-destruction and violence and death that only ends for a temporary amount of time at the Tower of Babel when man is scattered. And that ends the first section of Genesis that we just studied. And that first section ends without a lot of hope, even though in chapter 3 there's a promise made that that the seed of woman would crush the serpent's head, and that the serpent would bruise the heel of this person. We don't hear much more about that promise until we get to chapter 12 and verses 1 through 3. This is really the missing link that has been up until now wasn't understood by the people. It gives us the understanding and the purpose of the book and really the entire Bible here. In chapter 12 and verses 1 through 3, it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." There's a lot of imagery here going on, and we're going to go through some of that today, this morning. Let's look at kind of an overview of how the second part of Genesis here is laid out. So we have the first part of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, roughly 2,000 years of history. And then we have from Abraham to Joseph is just a few hundred years of history. And so the guiding principle of what's going on here, as we're thinking about what's going on, we need to have this sort of principle in the back of our minds, is that throughout this storyline, throughout this narrative, there's a covenant that God has always had with them, and that is commonly called the covenant of grace. That God's gracious dealings with people who truly believe in Him from the time of Adam onward are going to be recipients of the blessings that God has promised. And first, there's stories of humans grieving God, right, in the garden, and breaking their covenant fellowship. And this is then narrowed down by stages until we finally have a single individual from the scattering at Babel, and his name is Abram. And his name will later be changed to Abraham, and there's a lot of meaning there involved. But we'll skip over that for right now, because I want to look at the big picture of how God makes a promise to Abraham. We just read that. And this promise is the first step of God and His plan of restoration and redemption back to the goodness of the garden. God was going to rescue mankind through this family. And so this section of Genesis has several features that set about to define it. So there's several defining features in this section. I lost my place in my notes, sorry. Promises to Abraham through the family. There we go. The first defining feature is that each of the 4 generations that are listed are marked by repeated failure. And they just keep making really bad decisions, right? And they put God's promise of blessing all men through them in danger. But God remains faithful to them, and He frequently rescues them from themselves, right? And in each of these generations listed here, God renews His promise of blessing to them in each one of these generations. And He renews that blessing to all nations through them. And so because these 4 generations of Abraham are blessed with wealth, earthly wealth, they're very rich. Sometimes they grow into a great big family and a nation. They're given this promise of this super blessing in the future, whatever that is. We don't really know what it is yet. It's easy to see these stories, and we mentioned this in the Bible class, it's easy to see these stories as stories of how to be a good person. Like, I'll just go do what this guy did and be a good person. The problem is, these families and the people involved in the families are often very dysfunctional. And so I want to take a closer look at how 2 members of this family are really a reflection of the story that happens in the garden. And then next Sunday, we'll look at the next 2. The first one is Abraham, and you might recognize this graphic. It's from our handout. Chapter 12 here begins with that promise that we read. And that promise is twice given, that Abraham would have a family, right? The way we have families is pretty obvious. We have a wife, a man, and a female, and they have relations, and they have children. The problem is, before this chapter is even over, Abram gives away his wife. And this is not going to be the last time he does this either. We can see chapter 20 and Abimelech. We went over that sort of in detail this morning. And Sarah isn't innocent either. She gets impatient about having a son, and so she has Abraham sleep with her servant Hagar. And it leads to this family feud that still exists today, right? Sarah then turns on Hagar when she's pregnant and mistreats her. And Abraham's son mistreats Abraham's son that's inside of her. You got to remember, these are prominent themes that are going on. And one of the other themes that goes on, we mentioned also, was land this morning. The promise of land, of becoming a great nation and having a great name, and blessings. Those are all tied back to the previous chapters. If you notice, he's using the same language that he used for Babylon. In the Tower of Babel, what was one of the defining features that they wanted to do in chapter 11 was, and I didn't write it down, so let me see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, chapter 11, verse 4. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into the heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name." They were arrogantly trying to make for themselves a name. They were going to do it for themselves. They weren't taking God as their own image. They were going to make for themselves a name. What about chapter 2? When God creates man and he blesses them, this is the same promise that's made to Abraham. And he's going to bless them. Not only that, but he gives them land. He gives them a garden. Chapter 12, Abraham is promised a land. Some other points here. Let's look at some of the points in the life of Abraham. I'm just going to kind of go quickly through this because I want to hit a lot of different things this morning. But the question that we often have is why? Why Abraham? Well, I think the last line of chapter 3 there really makes it clear to everyone. It's not that Abraham was some super person who was better than everyone else. The purpose of choosing Abraham was so that God, and that in him, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Why Abraham? It was so that all the families of the earth could be blessed. It's the ultimate reversal of the Tower of Babel and Babylon. It's the ultimate reversal of the flood. It's the ultimate reversal of getting kicked out of the garden. God is going to undo all of that unrighteousness that caused that. And it's the key to understanding the rest of the biblical story, of the narrative that's going on here. God's plan is to rescue his rebellious creation, that's humanity, through Abraham's family. And this family is going to later take on the name that we're more familiar with, right? His grandson, Jacob. It's also known as Israel. So Israel will become a kingdom of priests, it says, and in the very next part of the saga here of the first 5 books of the Bible in Exodus chapter 19, Israel, this family, is going to become a kingdom of priests. What do priests do? Priests go between God and man. So the whole point of choosing Abraham and choosing Israel was to show other nations what God was like through his dealings with them. And so that's a major theme that is used by the prophets. In the evenings, we were getting ready to study the minor prophets especially, and we were starting with Hosea, but there's a major theme that's used by these prophets to show that this future messianic king would be the perfect representation of God, that he would be the image of God to humanity. He would show them what it meant to be an image of God, to be a priest king a go-between, but also a ruler. What was mankind's role here on earth? He said to rule over it and to use it for your benefit. His role of this perfect human priest-king would be to redeem all of humanity. And that by shifting our faith in our ability to choose for ourselves right and wrong back to the standard of the garden of faith in God as our everything, that would be the ultimate goal of what is promised here in chapter 12 and verse 3 of all families of the earth being blessed. That is the whole point here. So we have different covenants that are then made in Genesis. Specifically, I didn't list them, but we have at least two here that we've gone over so far that are called covenants. The covenant with Noah that he then promptly breaks following the flood and making the covenant with God. And then we have the covenant with Abraham, which he, before the chapter's out, breaks. So let me read a definition real quick of how I would define covenant. A covenant is a sort of divine human relationships that. Sorry, I should just read it off the slide. A chosen relationship or partnership in which two parties make a binding promise to each other and work together for a common goal. That's the common definition of what a covenant is. Frequently in the Bible, covenants are what we might call one-sided. The promises are all made by God, and then we are required to accept those promises to be a part of the covenant. And so this sort of divine human relationships here really move the story forward. They move the narrative forward until it reaches this sort of climax in Jesus. So therefore, to tell the story of God redeeming his people through Jesus is to tell the story of God's covenantal relationship with his people. So God makes a covenant with Abraham in chapter 15, and again in chapter 17. God makes a covenant with Abraham saying that all nations are going to be blessed through his family. And Abraham fails along the way, but he learns to trust in God's promises. And the rest of the book of Genesis is going to trace this story of Abraham and the 4 generations there of his family. In each generation, we're going to see human failure is going to be paired with God's commitment to rescue and to bless them. So the story ends in Genesis chapter 50 with Joseph summarizing, right? In chapter 50 and verse 20, he says, "You planned this for evil, but God for good." But God planned it for good to save many lives. And it's the undoing of all the sin in between is the God planned it for good to save many lives. That's the undoing, to get back to the garden. And so there's 5 major covenants here in the Bible. In Genesis, we've seen the Noah covenant and the Abrahamic covenant. And there's several defining characteristics of these covenants, and there's no real consensus on the number of covenants. Some people say there was a covenant with Adam, even though it doesn't use the word covenant. And so whatever, there's 5 covenants that are explicitly mentioned in the scriptures that form this sort of backbone of the Bible. And those are the ones that were made with Noah, with Abraham, with Israel, and with David. And by Israel, I don't mean Abraham's grandson. I mean the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. And then with David, and then the new covenant that was inaugurated by Jesus. And so you'll want to know these covenants and what they are, because they help keep moving that narrative forward until we get to the climax of that narrative that is Jesus, right? So Noah enters into this formal relationship with God and all living creatures, and God promises that despite humanity's evil, he will never destroy them again. And he reiterates that cultural mandate sort of that was of chapter 1 and verse 26, when he says, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and the cattle and over all the earth and over the creeping things that creep over the earth." And God, that was 26. We want 28. I thought that was wrong. "And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So humans are supposed to be rulers. We're supposed to be kings over the earth, part of it anyway. And he invites humans to partner with him, with God. God invites the humans to partner with him. And when we get to the Abrahamic covenant, when we get to Abraham's covenant, God enters into this partnership with him that redeems them from what was going on. And he does it with Abraham, and it's developed progressively through chapters 12 and 15 and 17. It's not all at once. He promises Abraham a huge family, a large family, that is going to inherit a promise, and a promised piece of land specifically in Canaan, and bring this universal blessing that's going to bless all humanity through his family. And he can remember the promises like this. He promises offspring, he promises land, and he promises universal blessing. And those three units are repeated over and over to not only Abraham, 3 times to Abraham, but also to his son Isaac, and also to Jacob, and then to the family of Jacob, his sons. So that was Abraham and the covenants that were made with Abraham. Let's look at Isaac. I just have a couple slides on Isaac because Isaac is not quite as big a character in the storyline here as Abraham is. But in general, Isaac and his story takes place in chapters 25 and 26. And I wanted to answer this question real quick because it came up last week, and we answered it in Bible class, but I want to go over it again. Is why did God ask Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? What kind of God would ask that, right? Is this some sort of child sacrifice thing that we need to be participating in? And didn't God call them out of those types of things because the nations around them were doing those, and God was going to judge those nations? Well, the idea here is not about child sacrifice. It's about the fact that Abraham didn't have to sacrifice. See, the long wait for Abraham wasn't the long wait for Isaac was not Abraham's true test. It was in the next chapter when God tells Abraham to take that beloved son and sacrifice him. Abraham must have been confused. I mean, why would he promise him a son to take it away? Was this some sort of evil trick or inconsistency in God? Well, this wasn't Abraham's first experience with God. Abraham obeyed God's unexpected command because he trusted God's promise and he knew him. He knew God's character. That's why we went over those questions this morning in the Bible class. What characteristics are shown by God? If we know those characteristics, we can trust God and see that he is a good God and see that he is trustworthy, that he is faithful. Abraham obeyed God's command because he trusted God's promise and he knew him to be a good and trustworthy God. Abraham didn't think Isaac was going to die. We went over that in this morning's lesson, but if you also want a second opinion, other parts of the Bible mention that as well. Genesis chapter 22 and verse 5, but also Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 9 say that Abraham didn't expect it, or he expected God to raise him from the dead. This is also a form of prophetic reenactment, and this is one of the exciting things about the minor prophets especially, but also the major prophets. They did what I would call, or what some people call, prophetic reenactment. For example, we're going to look at Hosea in the evening, and Hosea, what does he do? God tells him to marry a prostitute. And then beyond that, he tells him to buy her back after running away. And so, what about Ezekiel? God told Ezekiel to lie on his side for over a year. That was going to symbolize the siege of Jerusalem in Ezekiel 4. Well, what son are we talking about here that Abraham was going to sacrifice? Well, Genesis 22 points us to Jesus. Some of the design patterns here of what's going on in the narrative of Isaac and Abraham, there's three aspects here that kind of become a pattern of what's going to go on. There's new life where there once was death, right? Chapter 1 in the garden. There's new life. God creates life where there was not life before. There was only darkness and chaos before the world, or before he created humanity. He creates life. God establishes a covenant with his creatures that he's newly created with them, and in chapter 1 in verses 28 through 29 there. And the event takes place in Eden, which we understand as sort of a high place, right? Because there was a river flowing out of Eden. Got to flow downhill. High places are a common theme in Genesis and the whole of the story here in the Torah, the first 5 books. They often camp on high places. When Abraham goes somewhere to camp, he camps at a high place. And this is all very symbolic of God creating new life, creating a new covenant, and that the high place is sort of the promised place. It provides protection, it provides food, and it provides the promises that God wants for us. And so you can see those patterns repeated later on through the stories. And so in Genesis chapter 22, when we see Isaac, and when they're going up the mountain to offer Isaac, there's many cases where it parallels Christ. And this is where I wanted to kind of bring everything that we've talked about this morning. This is not the closing, but this is sort of tying these thoughts together, right? Because we want to see how the Old Testament, we want to see how the Hebrew Scriptures point to Jesus. And in the case of Isaac, there's many parallels, right? In both cases, they're called beloved sons. And so what are we talking about here? We're talking about somebody who was very loved, not only by his father, but by God the Father, because he is the child of promise. The story of Isaac follows this pattern, again, that we looked at on the last slide also. I forgot to mention that. God creates a new life where there wasn't life. God establishes a covenant, and it takes place at a high place. Same thing happens at Sinai. God shows that pattern again. He creates a new life where there wasn't life. He's getting ready to wipe out the nation because of their sin. But God establishes a covenant. They're both beloved sons. Let me get back to the slide now. They're both beloved sons who've been long awaited. They're born in miraculous circumstances. Both Jesus and Isaac. Both Jesus and Isaac carry the wood that is going to be one of the instruments of their death on their back. And the Father leads the Son, and the Son follows obediently towards his death. God provides the sacrifice, which Abraham says will be a lamb. Jesus is also known as the Lamb. There was an innocent son involved here that went willingly up the mountain to die. Jesus went up the mountain, up the hill of Golgotha to be crucified. And so one of my goals with this series is to show you guys, the listeners, how the Hebrew Scriptures point to Jesus and how we can tell our neighbors about those things. So what do all these parallels mean, right? Well, Abraham and Isaac point beyond themselves to the Messiah. And that's how we need to read the Scriptures, is pointing to something better. They're always expecting something better. Abraham didn't expect that his son wouldn't exist anymore. He knew that either God could raise him from the dead or God would provide a lamb, one or the other. The prophets repeatedly tell of a king that's going to come and renew life to Israel. And he does this by establishing a new and better covenant, Hebrews 8, right? Where does that happen? On a hill, on a cross, in a high place. There's life where there was death, and now Christ gives us life. The same pattern here that's followed. There's an exchange in Genesis chapter 2, the ram in place of Isaac, right? And this is going to point to a greater exchange that happens at the cross, the Son of God in place for us. In Jesus, God brought his own promised Son, his own promised Messiah, into death, and then through it, just like Isaac, God spares humanity because he takes that cross onto himself at that high place in Golgotha. It's really an amazing concept when we tie all these things together. And so that brings us to the covenant that's made there at the cross, right? It's called the New Covenant. The New Covenant is this sort of culmination of God's saving work in his people or for his people. So he promises to make this everlasting covenant with his people. And in that covenant, he's going to write the law on their hearts, and he's going to bring complete forgiveness for sins. And he's going to put his Spirit in them to empower them to love and obey his commands. And he's going to raise up this king that's like David, this Davidic king, to rule over them, to rule like they should be ruling. But they can't or won't. They choose not to. This Messiah figure is going to bring them back into the land and reunify them into the one people of God. And he's going to cause them to be a light to all the nations. I mean, that's just mind-blowing, right? This new covenant is explicitly introduced by the prophets in the context, though, of what? Total failure. The kings and the people and even the religious leaders have failed to keep God's commands. And it turns out that God's covenant people that he had tried to make this covenant with, or did, were nothing but covenant breakers. And so the curses of the covenant come on them, those curses that are mentioned in Deuteronomy, in the Song of Moses. They come upon them. They're carried and exiled off to Babylon and Assyria. And while they're in Babylon, in Assyria, the prophets give us hope, right? Jeremiah, who's in captivity by this point, gives us hope that God would one day bring about a new covenant, a better covenant, Hebrews says. So the anticipation of this covenant through the prophets pushes the story forward into the pages of the New Testament, where we're introduced into a new character of the story. We're introduced into Jesus, the one who's going to fulfill all these prophetic promises and bring about a blessing for all peoples. And God preserves the world through Noah, and he initiates the redemption through Abraham, and he forms a special people through Israel, and a promised shepherd king, priest king through David. And then he fulfilled all of his covenantal promises through Jesus. And so Jesus perfectly succeeded at every point of where humans failed in the covenant with God. This makes him, the fact that he did that makes him the guarantor or the mediator of a new and better covenant. That's what Hebrews chapter 7 8 and 9 is all about. Now, people from every nation and tribe and tongue who are joined to Jesus in faith are part of that new covenant family that experience the rich blessings of that new covenant. That's what Galatians chapter 3 says. So let's kind of tie all these thoughts together here. In covenants, in a covenant, God makes certain promises, and in exchange, He asks His partners to fulfill certain commitments. God promises to bless the world through Abraham despite their repeated failure. I mean, we have aging husbands and impatient mothers, or not mothers yet, to be impatient matriarchs over the family. We have deceptive brothers, family betrayal. And so it's difficult for us to see sometimes how God's promise is going to prevail. We have the whole story here, so it's easy for us to see, right? But you got to put yourself in their shoes. How is God's promise going to prevail? Well, the biblical story isn't asking us to just simply understand the idea of God. And this is where it all hits home. In the story of Jesus, we are being invited to know and to be known by this being we call God. God wants us to participate in His eternal love through a covenant with Him. The Bible isn't just giving us some new ideas to think about or new ways to know God, right? It's an invitation for you to know the Creator and to discover why you exist in this universe. And the answer is not overly difficult. It's really unmistakably simple. You exist to be loved. If you haven't known the love of God previously, or you want to make that commitment to God, you can do that this morning through faith. You can make the commitment to love God through faith. And if you want to do that, please come forward and let somebody know, and we can help you with that this morning. And that's the lesson for this morning.